Welcome everyone, I'm Ashley Klein-Jimenez with Prevent Connect, and you're joining us for our web conference session today titled Community Accountability for Safety, Building Capacity to Make Sexual and Domestic Violence Prevention a Community Responsibility. Prevent Connect is a national project of the California Coalition Against Sexual Assault and is sponsored by the U.S. Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. The views and information provided in this web conference do not necessarily represent the official views of the United States government, the CDC, or CalCASA. I'm really excited to be here today once again with our wonderful partners at Prevention Institute. And so I want to hand over the podium now to Alicia Somji with Prevention Institute to introduce the rest of the team.
Thanks, Ashley. Hi, everyone. This is Alicia. I'd like to introduce both Allie and Morgan. Morgan's new to the Prevent Connect community, so we're really excited to have her on board, and you'll be seeing more of her as we continue in our series this year. And then we also do have Lisa, who is on the phone lines. She may chime in at some point. But let's get into our objectives for today. So each year we like to pick 1 to 2 exploratory topics, and this is definitely one of those. And we're really excited to have Mimi Kim here, who is a national thought leader. Today we're going to be exploring how protective factors in the sociocultural environment can prevent sexual and domestic violence, looking at things like social inclusion, networks, community sanctions against violence, and then we'll talk a little bit more about national and local efforts to shift toward community accountability, and as always, engage in a candid discussion. And this time it'll be on how primary prevention connects to intervention-based responses. So we really do encourage you to use the text chat as we go and engage in some dialogue with us. So to get us started, I'd like to introduce Thrive. I've been doing this in the past few web conferences that we've been doing. Those of you who haven't been part of a Prevent Connect web conference before, Thrive is a community resilience framework and tool that helps us think about community-level prevention for a range of issues. Through this series, we're applying it to sexual and domestic violence prevention to look at how people, place, and opportunity environments relate to sexual and domestic violence prevention. Specifically today, we're zooming in on the people cluster. Those of you who were part of our web conference at the end of May, you may have joined us in a conversation about norms and masculinities. And for those of you who didn't, we are going to share the link to that web conference if you'd like to check that out. So that really had to do with the norms and culture. And today, we're going to be looking at some of the other factors in the people cluster, specifically, as I mentioned, social networks and trust, as well as community sanctions. So to start us off here, I really want to give you some definitions and make sure we're on the same page before we get into a deeper conversation. So for social networks and trust, this really has to do with trusting relationships among community members, having opportunities to exchange information, and strengthen those connections. Other words that you may have heard of before that have to do with this are community cohesion, which has to do with mutual trust and solidarity in a community or neighborhood, and also social inclusion, which is the process of supporting individuals and groups to take part in society. Then when it comes to community sanctions, this may be something that we haven't talked about as much in the past, but it refers to moral and social pressure from the broader community to intervene and address and prevent sexual and domestic violence. And one of the words that's often used in the public health world that has to do with this is collective efficacy, which really has to do with the willingness to act for the common good. And so I know that's a lot of definitions all at once, but hopefully some of you have started to look at things like social cohesion or social networks or community sanctions. And so I'd like to put a text chat question out there and ask all of you how you're promoting these different elements in the sociocultural environment in your work currently. So please feel free to text chat at this point. We'll come back to see what you're all saying. But just to share some of the research, so I've introduced some of these terms and definitions. Prevention Institute did some research last year collecting kind of what's out there in the literature about domestic violence. And these factors that we're talking about today were really shown to have associations. So looking at strong social cohesion, we found that was associated with a reduced risk of domestic violence. Social isolation is a risk factor, and community sanctions, again, are another protective factor that can prevent domestic violence. We haven't done the same research as of yet on sexual violence, but we would expect to see similar so I'd like to turn back to our text chat. I know we haven't had that much time for you all to chime in, but Ashley, what's coming up so far?
Sure. So it looks, Alicia, like people are probably thinking about this and just getting started in answering this question. But we have some folks who are saying, stressing human commonalities throughout the work that they're doing is a way to promote social cohesion and social networks. Approaching violence prevention through a lens that is including intersecting identities and issues is another example. It looks like folks are partnering with other agencies in order to do some of this work. And so looking at how to do this through community advocacy is another approach that folks are taking. Anti-oppression work, focusing on bystander intervention to promote social cohesion. Those are some things that I'm seeing coming up, Alicia, that I think give us a good idea of what folks are doing now.
Yeah, no, thank you for that. I think the part about partnering with other organizations is something that sounds simple, and often we don't think about that as the whole social networks and social cohesion, but I think when we're working with communities, we need to not only tell communities or work with communities to create cohesion amongst neighbors, but also between organizations that we're working with, and really employ that through our practice.
Absolutely.
So that's great to see. Great. So the last thing I want to talk about before we introduce our guest, Mimi, today is to talk about how prevention and intervention are mutually supportive. And today we're going to be really looking at that through the lens of looking at social networks and community sanctions and community accountability. And I really wanted to say many of the prevention practitioners that are likely on this web conference work in direct service organizations, or are interfacing with direct service providers. And there's a great deal of connection between the work that folks are doing in intervention and prevention. And so I'm hoping that through this web conference and having Mimi share about some of the intervention work with regard to social networks and community accountability, we can start to think about how that relates to our prevention work and really start to draw those connections and how we can work together for those mutual outcomes. And we can start to really think about how to create community accountability in responding to sexual and domestic violence, and how that affects the norms that support prevention. So with that, I'd like to introduce Mimi Kim. Mimi, can we just do a quick sound check for you, and then I will do your bio?
Sure. I hope you can hear this.
Yeah, that's great. All right, so Mimi is a longtime anti-violence advocate and activist, primarily working in Asian immigrant communities and other communities of color. She was the coordinator of the multilingual access model at the Asian Women's Shelter in San Francisco for 10 years before she founded Creative Interventions in 2004 to create more practical, concrete, and accessible community-based models and tools for violence intervention. Mimi is one of the co-founders of Incite, Women's Trans and Gender Nonconforming People of Color Against Violence. Currently, she's working with Creative Interventions to mobilize a California statewide initiative to introduce and implement community-based and transformative justice violence intervention options through domestic violence and sexual assault organizations. And she's collaborating a lot with social justice organizations. Mimi is also an assistant professor of social work at California State University, Long Beach. So we're really excited to have Mimi here and learn from her leadership and expertise. Mimi, I know you'd like to start us off with grounding us with a story, which I think is a really great way to start. Before you get into the story, I want to pose another text chat question to all of you participating today. Mimi's going to share a story, and as she goes, I'd love for you to write in the text chat what your thoughts and feelings are with regard to the story and how you would describe this intervention that Mimi's going to share. So go ahead, Mimi. You can take it away.
Okay. Thank you so much, Alicia and Ashley. Yes, I'd really love to start this webinar with a story. This story may be one that's familiar to some of you on this webinar. For others, this may be the first time hearing it. But I think what this story does is provide a really great example of community-based approaches to violence prevention and intervention based upon the lives of everyday people. So please join me as I read this story as shared from the Maori community in New Zealand. This was shared as part of our Creative Interventions Project, Storytelling and Organizing Project, or STOP. I will read the story and I'll provide the story on the slide so that you can read along. I think that will make it easier for some of you. And please know that I'll be using English translations of the Maori words. So this is a small story. We live in a town, but many of my husband's extended family live in the valley where he grew up about 40 kilometers away. My husband and his brother are renowned for a number of things. One being how they extend the life of their cars and vans using highly technical items like string and wire. Another, how they share these vehicles for a variety of tasks, such as moving furniture or transporting relatives, building materials, tractor parts, traditional herbal medicines, eels, vegetables, dogs, and pigs, dead or alive. They are renowned for being people of the people, the ones to call on in times of trouble and death, the ones who will solve the problem and make the plan. They travel to and from town, to the coast to dive for seafood, to endless meetings, to visit extended family, along the many kilometers of dirt roads in and around the valley, through flood or dust, depending on the season, in those patched up, beat up, prized cars. There are a number of things to know about the valley. One is that the last 33 children in the world of their small sub-tribe to grow up and be educated on their own lands go to school here, despite government efforts to close the school. Another is that the valley is known to outsiders and insiders as Patu Wahine, literally meaning to beat women, and this is not said as a joke. The mountain for this valley is named as the doorway spirits pass through on their way to their final departure from this life. This valley is also the valley where my husband and his siblings were beaten at school for speaking their first language. It is a valley their mothers sent them to so they would be safe from their father, back to her people. It is where they milked cows, pulled a plow, fed pigs, but often went hungry and were stock-whipped, beaten, and worse. My brother-in-law still lives in the valley, in a group of houses next to the school. So it's no surprise that one of our cars would be parked by these houses, right by where the children play. Perhaps also not a surprise that while playing that time-old international game of rock throwing, our 8-year-old nephew shattered the back window of the car. If I'd been listening, I probably would have heard the oh and ah of the other children that accompanied the sound of glass breaking from town. And if I'd been really tuned in, I would have heard the rapid, frightened heartbeat of that boy as well. His mother is my husband's cousin, and she was on the phone to us right away. She was anxious to assure us that that boy would get it when his father came home. His father is a big man with pig hunter's hands who hoists his pigs onto a meat hook unaided. He is a man of movement and action, not a man for talking. Those hands would carry all the force of proving that he was a man who knew how to keep his children in their place. Beating that boy would be his way of telling us that he had also learned his own childhood lessons well. So before he got home, we burned up the phone lines, sister to sister, cousin to cousin, brother-in-law to sister-in-law, wife to husband, brother to brother. This was because my husband and his brother know that there are some lessons you are taught as a child that should not be passed on. The sound of calloused hand on tender flesh, the whimpers of watching sisters, the smell of your own fear, the taste of your own blood and sweat as you lie in the dust, useless, useless, better not born. This is a curriculum like no other, a set of lessons destined to repeat unless you are granted the grace of insight and choose to embrace new learning. So when the father of that boy came home and heard the story of the window, that boy was protected by our combined love and good humor, by the presence of a senior uncle, by invitations to decide how to get the window fixed in the shortest time for the least money. Once again, phone calls were exchanged with an agreement being made on appropriate restitution. How a barrel of diesel turns into a car window is a story for another time.
Thank you.
Next time my husband drove. I'm sorry about that. The slides. Next time my husband drove into the valley, it was to pick up the car, and that boy was an anxious witness to his arrival. My husband also has very big hands, hands that belong to a man who has spent most of his life outdoors. These were the hands that reached out to that boy to hug, not hurt. A lot of bad things still happen in the valley, but more and more they are being named and resisted. Many adults who learn their early lessons there will never return. For people of the land, this is a profound loss. Our first identifiers in meeting are not our own names, but those of our mountains, rivers, sub-tribe, and the tribe. To be totally separate from these is a dislocation of spirit for the already wounded. This is only a small story that took place in an unknown valley, not marked on many maps. When these small stories are told and repeated so our lives join and connect, when we choose to embrace new learning and use our bigness to heal, not hurt, then we are growing grace and wisdom on the earth. Story told by Di Grinnell from Whangarei, New Zealand.
Thank you for sharing that story, Mimi. I know that it's really resonating for a lot of folks. In the text chat, we're starting to see some things come up, and I'd like to ask those of you in the web conference, please feel free to continue text chatting your initial reactions to it. Ashley, do you want to share what's coming up so far?
Yeah, I mean, I think so. The first comment that I saw come up was I think, really perfect. Communal involvement, right? That's what we saw or heard in this story, but also coming together to interrupt violence and also to heal. As in this case, it was a family, a community, communal decisions to end a cycle of violence. Right, so understanding that this is something that was learned and passed on, and now people are coming together to shift that. Someone said that this story hurts in the most beautiful way. I think that's just something to elevate. And so it sounds like people are commenting on community coming together to help kind of interrupt or disrupt what could possibly happen.
Thanks, Ashley. Yeah, and someone else also wrote, it takes a community to raise a child, and I think that's very true. As you can see from that story, we're seeing connections to some of those factors that we talked about before, but really coming up in real ways, and seeing how an organic intervention relied on those protective things in the sociocultural environment related to social networks and sanctions. So Mimi, do you want to unpack it a little bit more for us?
Sure. I just, thank you so much. I think that this is such a powerful story. Continue to be moved by it. And I think that it has so many things to share with us. But I just want to highlight a couple of things that I think this story helps us with regard to our conversation today. And many of you have already raised that in the chat. But as I think of people who might identify as part of the prevention community or service provider community that I believe are many of you who are the audience today, I think the story reminds us that prevention or intervention responses to violence are so often carried out not by us, but among friends, within families, or in a community setting. They may never reach our phone lines. They may never come to our offices. So often, I've been working in domestic violence, we think of intervention work happening in shelters, happening in child welfare systems, and so on. especially when we think about violence or child abuse. But this story, I think, reminds us of what communities have done and really have done for centuries, if we think about it, and what communities can do. So while we know that community responses to violence can be negative or non-existent, I'm sure we could share many stories like that. I think this story reminds us that they can also be immediate, they can be organic, and they can be really positive. They can come out of care and compassion, not only for the victim or potential victim of violence, but for the person who may commit violence. These interventions can be creative, and perhaps you're also thinking in this case, they may be incomplete. The other thing that I found with this story from a valley far away in New Zealand is that it helps us think about what might be possible in our own families here in the United States, or in immigrant communities, or in communities of people who have lived here for many generations, among our own community members. It's a story that can easily be shared among our neighbors who may not respond to a webinar or who may never go to something where we talk about community accountability as we're doing today, but who may really be intrigued by the story of a community that might have something in common with their own. So I just want to use this to ask us also to think about our own relationship between our service provision models and our intervention models and these types of interventions. What kind of connections do we have, or do we have any connections at all? How are we supporting them? Are we offering any kind of support? And also, how can we use stories like this in our communities to start to imagine what community members have already been doing and what they can do? How can we use it to facilitate dialogue?
Thank you. I think that this is a really great way to start off our conversation today on community accountability. And I think the point you made about how things are happening in communities and in families, and we're labeling things in certain ways, is a really important thing to think about as we're talking about this today. So Mimi's going to get into a little bit more about what all of this means and what it looks like, but can you start us off with a little bit of the political context in the U.S. that calls for community accountability approaches to sexual and domestic violence?
Sure. Yeah, I wanted to talk a little bit about the political context, just to put this into some kind of perspective, particularly in times that we share today. For many of us doing this work in the anti-violence movement and social justice movements, I think many of us are aware that there is a crisis. Well, there are many crises going on, but many of us have been raising concern about what we call over-reliance on criminalization. And perhaps we're familiar with what is now a national concern over the crisis of mass incarceration. Some of us, I think, are familiar with the work of Michelle Alexander and the New Jim Crow, or some of us may have read Beth Rishi's work on Arrested Justice, Black Women, Violence in America's Prison Nation. Or we may be very concerned about what has been happening in Ferguson, in New York, in Baltimore, in Minneapolis, Los Angeles, Seattle, and so many of our communities that have been making it painfully clear that policing in the U.S. is at a crisis point. So I just want to turn to this graph. Some of you may be very familiar with this, this visual here, but one aspect of this crisis can be clear on a national level. We see that this graph shows the rates of incarceration, which have been relatively unchanged from 1945, which is the first date on the left hand of this graph. But in fact, if we went all the way back to 1920 when these statistics were collected, we would see a fairly flat rate with some bumps. But since 1973, we see that this has really skyrocketed, increasing by 500% over the next 40 years. What we may not realize is that many name 1973 as the start of this punitive turn, but it is also named as the start of the battered women's movement, one of the movements that I very much identify with. So this does not mean that we caused this, but this does mean that we might have a relationship, that the development of our movements, the battered women's movement and the anti-rape movement, actually parallels the development of what Beth Ritchie calls the prison nation, or what you might start hearing called the carceral state. I know this is still a very unfamiliar term, but you may start hearing that, and that refers to the part of our state or our government that is in charge of arrests, incarceration, jails, prisons, courtrooms. And these terms are increasingly used to describe the growing turn of our government away from social welfare, care, and education, and towards a focus on jails, prisons, and incarceration.
I didn't realize that the movement started at the same time as all of this, so that's really interesting to see. Cynthia in the text chat has brought up the school-to-prison pipeline, and I think that, of course, that has a lot of relevance in this conversation and what's being presented so far. And now I know, Mimi, you're going to kind of connect and show us how this political context connects to our goals of ending sexual and domestic violence and supporting accountability. And I think that some of this school-to-prison pipeline stuff and trying to prevent this from happening and supporting children in schools and some of these terms that you may be talking about with regard to transformative justice or restorative justice and community accountability plays into those school settings too. So I look forward to you maybe talking a little bit about that as we go. But can you now connect this to how this relates to our goals of ending sexual and domestic violence and supporting accountability?
Sure. I just want to move on to some of the words and terminology that some of you have been hearing. And I did want to use this opportunity of this webinar to link some of our work to some of these strategies that you may have been hearing about. I mean, I do say words because it can just become an alphabet soup of terminology, social networks. I think people are a little bit more familiar with restorative justice, transformative justice, community accountability, community-based interventions, and our over-reliance on criminalization. So I'll be using this and what I really hope to do is make a little sense of this all and do some clarification. Of course, I can only do so much on a webinar, but I hope that this is helpful. I think that another way of thinking about this work is considering what it is that we've wanted. We've been looking for social justice, we've been looking for women's rights, safety, accountability, solutions to different social problems. And as you know, a member of the audience has already pointed out, I think that what has concerned many of us is that these concerns have started to be swept into what has been called more broadly the prison pipeline. How is it that many of these concerns have now started to be framed, or have been for a long time, framed in the language of criminal justice, making us vulnerable to narrowly view domestic violence and sexual assault through the lens of crime control alone, or as a priority, rather than a broader social and political problem that requires multiple responses, or that this prison pipeline may itself be a form of violence and violation. So this is, I think, some of the political context that has motivated some of our focus now on community-based responses to violence. But I also want us to think a little bit about what survivors want or have been asking for. So for those of us who have been working on domestic violence, that are women, I know that for us, many of the solutions are these: escape to shelter, arrest somebody who's been doing harm or who's been abusive, asking people to leave a relationship as a way to solve the problem of domestic violence. But I will also want to look at what survivors have also been asking for. Can they stay safe at home? Can they stop the violence but stay in a relationship? Can they keep homes and communities intact? May they even want to keep their relationships with an abusive partner? So if we look at the left set of options, I think that we've done quite a bit of this work over the last 40 years. Or in fact, this might be almost all the work that we've done over the last 40 years. Most of our survivor services have been organized around the premise that the solution to domestic violence is achieved by some combination of escaping to shelter, arresting the abuser, or leaving the relationship. And I imagine most of us in this webinar have been helping to develop this set of responses, as I have. But what about these set of options on the right? How well have we done in providing a full set of options which might allow survivors to stay safe at home, perhaps even stay safe in a relationship with an abusive or once abusive partner? How can we stop and transform violence and find safety while keeping homes and communities intact? And I think for some of us, we may be asking ourselves, well, what do we want? What do we as advocates and providers want? So I want to pose the question, what do we want? And again, for the past 40 years, what we've worked for are primarily those responses on the left. When asked about how we could possibly provide the options on the right, I think we're still left with a set of questions. So I ask, what do we want and what's stopping us from being able to provide a full set of options, including those on the right? What changes would we need to make that possible?
Definitely. And I think that a lot of this connects with sexual and domestic violence prevention as well. And what survivors want resonates with what broader communities want. And broader communities want for residents to feel supported and to keep their neighborhoods safe, especially those of us working at the community level. These are the things that we're trying to do: keep our communities safe, build them in ways that promote safety, and keep our communities intact. We had someone in the text chat bring up financial stability as something that survivors want and that maybe we as prevention practitioners are also aiming for. And I think this connects really well to our web conference for July, which is going to be all about economic opportunity and looking at how economic opportunity in communities and in workplaces really can support prevention. But again, I do see those connections to supporting intervention and survivors too.
Absolutely. Thanks for bringing up about financial security. So, yeah, I just want to keep talking more about this current context. And what I want to raise is that, again, these terms that you saw on the list before, that there is kind of an alternative landscape of responses that I think is building up over the last 15 years or so. And I want to also point out a little bit more about what some of this terminology means. Much of this is not written. If you Google it, you might find a document here or there, but I'm going to give a little bit more of my interpretation of the current context. For some of you, you understand that the term transformative justice has caught fire in the last few years. I'm going to talk a little bit more about that in a minute or so. But there are these other terms that are often used to point to similar principles and strategies. Community accountability, the term used in the title of this webinar, has been used to highlight intervention prevention strategies that elevate the role of community, that share that domestic violence and sexual violence do not only occur between individuals, but take place in and impact broader community members. And they also point to communities as the places and the spaces where people can and should take greater or even a central role in creating solutions to violence. Some people use these terms interchangeably with transformative justice, while I in creative interventions now do use the term transformative justice, in part because it has such a great resonance and appeal to a growing number of people. Particularly in the past, I've more often used community accountability because one, that I've preferred a term with a little bit less gloss, and seems a little more within reach, but that also points to communities being accountable for violence happening and being accountable for those solutions. Alternatives to incarceration focus on a shift away from criminalization as a solution to violence, but often point to these same types of solutions. Community-based interventions or approaches can be an even broader way of looking at the great diversity of responses to violence that can take place in a community setting. So these might be big responses, they might be very small, they might be ambitious, they might be quite ordinary, It can be planned or very spontaneous. Also, the term restorative justice, which I know that is really piquing a lot of people's curiosity. I will not talk about this a lot today, but I will touch upon it. This is a term that has been getting an increasing amount of attention, and restorative justice approaches have been around for a while, particularly as a way to work with harms among youth or in schools. So some of you may be familiar with this work. While this term is often used interchangeably with transformative justice, I just want to point out now that transformative justice are responses that do not engage at all with the criminal justice system. It's wholly outside of the system, while restorative justice has often been driven by law enforcement or has been constructed in collaboration with the criminal justice system. So even though these terms overlap, even though many people that are practicing restorative justice also are working outside of the system, I just want to point this out as one difference that people often ask me about. I also want to highlight this, that there are many organizations, and probably many of you who are out there listening to this webinar right now, both within domestic violence and sexual assault provider networks, but within also broader organizational settings, social justice movement settings, including some of those who are outside of our anti-violence movement or perhaps even outside of the network of nonprofit organizations. Many of us have been working on alternatives or community accountability or transformative justice strategies, and many of us have been looking toward everyday community members to prevent and intervene in violence. So for myself, as Creative Interventions or as a member of Insight Women, Trans, and Gender and Nonconforming People of Color Against Violence, I can consider myself very much a part of a collective community of individuals and organizing, working together to shift away from the criminal justice system and towards strengthening community-based responses to violence. Some of you may be part of this community and might not find your names on the slide, but I hope that what this will generate is us getting closer connected and strengthening each other's work. So I want to move a little bit towards transformative justice because some of you have been curious about this term or have been using this term already. So more of us have been using transformative justice to define our strategies as one that is a framework that unifies us in our commitment to responses to violence that do not rely on the violence of law enforcement. So I'm using this visual that was created by Generation 5, which some of you may be familiar with. And just from using this, we can see that transformative justice is an overall philosophy or approach to justice. It's also a set of practices, and I'm just going to highlight a couple of things that are on the slide that has quite a bit on it, that is based on a vision of liberation, moving away from just the narrow focus on the end of violence. Transformative justice sees that our responses to violence are not only personal or individual, but they really envision transformation at the level of communities, towards collectives, and that as we shift away from law enforcement and towards strengthening community capacity, that these shifts can have a transformative impact on systems. I also want to highlight that this transformation understands interpersonal violence, gender violence, domestic violence, sexual assault, family violence, all these forms of harms as rooted in conditions of oppression. So they are also linked to poverty, racism, lack of jobs, targeting of indigenous communities, communities of color, LGBTQ communities by the police, the targeting of immigrant communities, particularly communities of color, by immigration control, by conditions of homophobia and transphobia, by conditions of ableism and other forms of oppression, so that these harms of interpersonal violence are linked or are intersectional with these other root causes of a violence rooted in our structures. I would say that those preferring the terms of community accountability or even community-based responses to violence often share these understandings of violence and commitments to transformative solutions. So another thing that I want to highlight is that a principle of these approaches, even if they don't call it holism, but is moving towards a more holistic model of responses to violence. So if we look to the left, I think many of us in the anti-violence movement feel strongly about centering support for survivors, for safety, self-determination, and for healing. I think more of us, and certainly I would expect that people on this call have also been calling for the transformation of communities and looking towards community members to be active in addressing harm, shifting attitudes, and supporting change. I think finally, if we look at these transformative solutions, that we are also embracing a holistic model that looks to really engage the person doing harm, moving away from the language of perpetrator or batterer, and moving towards one that lifts up the humanity of those that have done harm, or have caused harm, and looking at ways that we can seek approaches to violence prevention intervention that can creatively use compassion and care to support accountability as an alternative to our rather sole reliance on punishment as our definition of accountability. So we have been working to do that as well.
Yeah, I really like this graphic, and I really appreciate you taking the time to take us through some of these terms, because there really is a lot of terminology here, and words, as you said. So I'd like to ask a text chat question, and all of you participating today, how does what Mimi's sharing about community accountability relate to your prevention work, or if you aren't currently doing this type of work, relate to prevention more generally? And while you're responding, I thought that I would take the last graphic that Mimi shared with the 3 different segments and kind of relating them back to those factors that we talked about at the beginning that have been shown to be protective factors for sexual and domestic violence prevention. So firstly, we see that by providing these supports for survivors, by doing that, we're actually supporting those healthy norms that support healthy and equitable relationships, or norms that support nonviolence. And then by engaging people who have done harm, again, that also supports creating those norms that support nonviolence and engagement in family matters. And then when it comes to more of the community level and transforming communities to be active in all of this, it's really affecting all of this. By doing that, we're bringing communities closer together, really creating that strong collective efficacy, and changing those norms. And I think the story that Mimi shared at the beginning really highlights how all of that is happening and how bringing people together can be protective against violence. So Ashley, what's coming up in the text chat?
Yeah, well, Alicia, first I just wanted to say thank you so much for making those connections, because I feel like that really makes it clear how this relates to the prevention work that many in our audience are doing. So thank you for that. And I actually want to check in with my Prevent Connect colleague, Meghna, to see about what's coming up in the text chat.
I think some of the responses are focused on about humanizing like those who do harm, and in terms of holding perpetrators accountable. It also involves educating and outreach, to students and communities about tackling root causes of violence. Some of them have highlighted social justice issues, which can, create an obstacle for community building. Another example is gentrification and how that has been, not helping in terms of prevention. But I think the overall theme that I can see right now is about community accountability, and in terms of also holding those who do harm accountable, and how the education and how that helps to empower our communities.
Thank you, Meghna. And I think there were some comments on the multiple oppressions and how that relates to both of this intervention and prevention work, and being able to focus on those and centering on those that are most marginalized, and focusing on empowerment for everyone. So Mimi, can you share more about why social networks are important for community accountability and sexual and domestic violence? And if you have any responses to what we've been sharing from the text chat, feel free to comment as well.
Okay, sure. No, I'm happy that these themes are resonating with people in the audience. I just want to go in a little bit more on following the context of over-reliance on criminalization or on mass incarceration. I think that another side of this crisis then is our underdeveloped community response, and my guess is many people in this audience would agree. So this may be obvious for some of us, but if we think about why community is important, let's think about who really are our first responders. We usually think of first responders as 911, but who really are the first responders? Is it even our shelters? Is it our crisis lines? I think many of us would agree, and I'm thinking right now that, in fact, the first responders in violence are so often family members, friends, community members, neighbors, faith leaders, they might be co-workers, that people so often turn to those that they are closest to respond to violence. It may be with a direct request for help. It might be with a hint that they are in trouble. So given that these are so often our first responders, and again, many people refer to these people as social networks, but how much attention have we really paid to these networks in our own domestic violence work? So if we look at these different spheres of response to violence, we look at the right, we've got government services, so we can look at law enforcement responses. We shift over, this includes many of us on this webinar, service providers that were working on domestic violence or sexual assault, on family violence, on other related forms of social problems, that we also see formal social networks that are more in civil society. There's the civic groups, might be faith communities, social clubs, and so on. And on the very left are informal social networks, family, friends, neighbors, community members. So when we can think of these different spheres, we often think of government services and service providers first. If we think in terms of who has received most of the resources, even though these bars are not necessarily accurate, I think that we could agree that most of our resources over the past 40 years of our work have gone to government services. We as non-government service providers get considerable, if dwindling, resources. I understand that that is absolutely the case, but from these same sources, but also from private foundations and individual donors. Our formal social networks might run voluntarily or seek membership dues and so on. But if we look at how first responders are so often informal social network members, this is such an untapped opportunity to work more with these networks. Networks that have received so little attention in our own work often do not even get recognized as people intervening in violence and receive really a drop in the proverbial bucket compared to these other resources.
That's very true. And these informal social networks and communities definitely play a large role, and there is definitely, I think, an untapped opportunity there, both for prevention and intervention, and really using those informal social networks or even the formal ones. Since we know that social networks are a protective factor against sexual and domestic violence, this is a great place to support residents. This is really where we can see prevention and intervention being mutually supportive. And with regard to what Mimi presented on over-criminalization, both in the beginning and then bringing it up again now about how it's both an issue of over-criminalization and lack of using the resources that we have, I wanted to provide a quick example. It makes me think about how over-criminalization can weaken social networks. So many predicted, and we've started to see sexual and domestic violence reporting going down with immigrant groups over the last little while due to fear in the current political landscape. Especially now, I think that these informal and formal social networks and community accountability have a really large role to play in preventing and responding to violence. And so it's definitely an important time right now to focus on community-based responses to both prevent and intervene in violence. One theme that I saw come up in the text chat a couple of minutes ago was with regard to social networks and isolating certain individuals. And so I'm not sure if you want to say anything about that, Mimi, or how that's worked in your work of making sure that certain individuals, for example, those who have done harm, could be excluded from certain groups. But also, I'd love for you to just continue the conversation on how do we increase community capacity to really respond to sexual and domestic violence. I think that a lot of folks here are working on prevention and, again, interfacing with direct service providers, and so they'd really appreciate learning more about community-based interventions that support accountability and relate to those protective factors.
If I understand the comment correctly, I think you may be thinking about the ways in which social networks have also been a negative factor in supporting survivors of violence, and that in fact is very true. I know that, social networks we tend to use in a positive sense, but I think we understand that people, families, and communities, these same resources that I've been talking about, have often been in the way of protecting survivors or have colluded with people that have done harm. So one of the things I think in our model of community accountability is to understand communities not only as a source of the solution, but as taking accountability for the ways in which they have supported harm. So I think in forwarding or promoting something that has a positive view of social networks, one is that this is not to say that social networks haven't been negative, but this is a way to really lead forward towards having social networks, even those that have been negative in the past, to think more clearly about how they could be positive. So I like the first story, for example, because it takes a social network that could so easily have done something very different than what they did, a very everyday family, and show that these same social networks could actually do something positive. So this is the work that we're really having to do, is to promote the ways in which communities understand themselves as being part of a system of violence, but how they can also start seeing themselves as part of the solution to violence. And this has to be done with having stories and dialogue and the kinds of models and tools that actually engage them at the level of them being helping out. So I'm going to move towards looking a little bit more at some of these examples. And thinking about, being asked about these community-based interventions, really have to look across a lot of different models that have been developed in the past few years. But models that have been developed within this kind of framework of community accountability, transformative justice, and some of the kind of political concerns that I raised before. So on the one hand, we could see that some of these responses focused a little bit more on primary prevention. And some of them have looked more at the continuum from prevention to even tertiary intervention. Some of them have responded more in terms of interventions to violence. And I'll give you examples so that is a little bit clearer. The second category I want to look at is this, that we can think of many of these interventions as being led or facilitated by someone that might be a peer, that might be actually from the family itself, for example, the first story we heard, or that we might be moving towards something that's more trained or a more professionalized form of facilitation or leadership. And the third category that I am asking to consider is, what is the process of prevention or intervention? Is it a very informal process, or are we looking at processes that are more and more formal or have a kind of a structured method? So I put these into a table. The table is two-dimensional, so it didn't include prevention to intervention, although we'll be talking about that. But if we look at the left, we might see that some of these are community-driven interventions and prevention responses, not facilitated in any way or very informally. And then we're moving towards perhaps a facilitation by somebody who's a peer, moving towards a facilitation by somebody who's a peer but who has been trained in some way or has been identified as having certain kinds of skills. And finally, a facilitation that's done more by, I think, the kinds of work that we're accustomed to, which is carried out by a professional that's in a service provider network. On the top, you'll see categorization then by informal types of processes, perhaps some kind of guided by some set of shared principles, but with no real set method. We might have things that are a little bit more flexible. There might be some kind of method or approach and some set of shared principles. And finally, we have approaches that are much more formal and structured. So we'll return to this table a couple more times today, but I just want to point out the family intervention in a small story. We could see this as very informal. Perhaps they had principles of wanting to share compassion within the family, that they care about each other, but there wasn't a real set method. I think they just did what needed to be done. Communicate by phone. It was community-driven, not facilitated, although we don't know what role the uncle played. So it maybe was a little bit more facilitated than we even received when we got the story. So we can see that as the most informal intervention. And then we look at the other corner with restorative justice. I'm not going to talk about this very much, but I think people are a little bit more familiar with restorative justice circles and approaches that are used with youth. Tend not to be used very much with adults at this point. Some child welfare systems are starting to use some kind of family group conferencing that might be facilitated by a professional. Survivor impact panels, I can talk about that in the Q&A if people are curious about that. But we see things that are more formally determined. They might have set criteria. They might have trained professionals. They might have very strict guidelines as to how this process is carried out, who leads it, who participates. They often are taking place together with some involvement of law enforcement.
Thanks, Mimi. Can we get into some examples now?
Sure. So thinking about this, if those categories help people, that's great. If they don't, then hopefully these examples will help. I just wanted to point out some examples of people that have been really doing excellent work in making community-based interventions and prevention responses a reality. So I want to start out with the Northwest Network. The Northwest Network of bi, trans, lesbian, and gay survivors of abuse in Seattle, who have developed a community-strengthening approach to end violence and abuse by building loving and equitable relationships in our community. Those are their words. So this first started out as something called the Far Out program, and at that time they stated, and this is in quotes, "We know that building strong friendships helps people resist isolation and abuse. Our Friends Are Reaching Out, a Far Out program, works with survivors and their closest friends and family to create a community culture that values open and honest communication while developing more sustainable and meaningful connections among community members." So we can see this as a prevention program meant to build strong and healthy LGBTQ communities that are able to talk openly about healthy relationships, that can gain some skills to prevent violence and to intervene in harm. This is by now developed into a 7-week relationship skills class, so I just pulled out an ad for their latest class that looks at various things like identifying values, defining accountability, identifying expectations and negotiating them, and so on. And we can see that just recently that they collaborated with API, or Asian Pacific Islander CHAYA, another community-based organization in Seattle that works primarily with Asian Pacific Islanders, to co-lead a similar course that's targeted to API community members. Another project I want to highlight is the Bay Area Transformative Justice collective that's in the Bay Area. It's a collective of community members looking to build and support transformative justice, and they do use the language and principles of transformative justice to respond to child sexual abuse. So this organization started in the Bay Area in 2002, and it is a completely volunteer organization, completely out of the nonprofit organizational structure, and just relying on the time, the energy, the resources, the food, the goodwill of the people that are within this organization. I just want to, they do a lot of work, but I want to highlight the concept and practice of building pods. Some of you might be familiar with this. They found that the term and the use of the concept of community was really just too big and abstract for people to make into a reality. They found it wasn't really very helpful when people were considering who they would really turn to, who would be their first responders in a situation of harm. So pods, according to BATJC, are the people in our lives that we would call on to support us with things such as our immediate and ongoing safety, accountability, and transformation of behaviors, or individual and collective healing and resiliency. So much of their work is on supporting individuals to identify those that would be in their pod or are in their pod, to build conversations about harm and safety and accountability within those pods, and strengthen the ability of these intimate networks of individuals to really provide forms of prevention and intervention in situations of harm. So we can think of pods as being really meaningful building blocks for accountable communities. Again, the work of pods, and you can see is more on the continuum of prevention, leading to units of community that could actually intervene in violence as well.
These are really great examples. Can you get into a little bit more about what you're doing at Creative Interventions?
Sure. So some of you are familiar with, or maybe you're just hearing about the work of Creative Interventions. So this is an organization that I started. I just want to give you a little context that when I started becoming more concerned about some of the limited responses to violence that we've already talked about today, I became more and more convinced of the promise of community-based approaches. But I also saw that we weren't doing much in our movements to actually build and strengthen these approaches, or even identify them as central to our work. I turned outward to see, I just thought at the time that I would find all these other great examples in the United States that had models for us to use, but I really was disappointed to find that there was very little. We're talking about 2004, and I think it's a little bit better today. So at that time, in 2004, I decided to take this desire and rather just than building just a critique, to actually make this a reality. So I connected to others that had the same interests and concerns, and built an organization called Creative Interventions in the Bay Area. So you can see that we saw ourselves as building resources for everyday people to end violence and to make these an everyday practice. Our goal was to build at least one working model for these interventions and to create some accessible tools so they could be implemented by everyday members, regardless of whether our organization of Creative Interventions was around. So to not be reliant on a nonprofit organization, but to really build the ways that people can do this in their own organic communities. Or we didn't use the language of pods, but we might think about this as work that we could do in pods. So I really saw this specifically, like returning to some of the slides of the that we previously saw, that this was that we were already doing so much to provide the kind of options we had on the left, we had so little on the right, and I really saw creative interventions as moving towards providing kind of responses that would allow for some of these options that were on the right. So instead of telling people that we have this set of options, for example, we have shelter, we have access to legal advocacy, we can help you get a restraining order, and so on, and like offering a list of options, we asked people who sought our support what they wanted. It was an open-ended question. We asked what they wanted, what were their goals, and so on, and helped to support people to reach those goals. Again, looking at the slide that we saw previously, we really saw the first responders as family, friends, and neighbors, and we also knew that these formal social networks were important places that people go to. So we opened up our responses to anyone who contacted us and who were interested in addressing harm. So this might have been a survivor, but we had people call us that were and come to our office that we had at the time. That was an aunt, a friend, a sister. We always began by asking, who do you want to bring with you? Inviting a collective response that involved people's first responders. One of our central principles was that of holism. So we opened our event interventions to collective community members and wanted our interventions to include the interests of those who cause harm. This was, I have to say, definitely a shift for me as one who had spent years doing more conventional anti-violence work, where we always focused on the survivor to the exclusion of the person who had harmed them. Certainly can talk more about this in the Q&A. Even leaving out people's closest community members when we looked at interventions to violence.
So Mimi, we only have about 15 minutes left, so if we can try and get through things, maybe skip the evaluation too.
Yes, I will do that. So we also wanted to redefine our role as a provider and see ourselves not as those people providing intervention, but really being a facilitator of an intervention that would happen in a different space. So what do we provide as facilitators? We were there to meet with anyone wanting to intervene, asking questions but not offering a solution. We were there to help people in crisis, to clarify what was going on, what they wanted. The intervention we did not see as happening at our office or with us, but the intervention happening in the community, in their homes, in their streets, and places where the harm occurred in the first place. So we were a sounding board. We could help with role plays. And sometimes we wrote down what people said or took pictures of our big whiteboard so they could keep track of their thoughts, ideas, and strategies. And that we saw that we had a new model of accountability. I'm not going to get into this, but seeing accountability as a process rather than an event or a state of being. Understanding that people often resist accountability, so that we had to have a process that would take this into account. And finally, with the components of the creative interventions model, which you can learn much more about on our website, were things that we found after doing this work and piloting it for 3 years. What were some of the common elements to our model? One was doing an assessment, which we call getting clear, and we have certain tools to use for that. We didn't want to use the kinds of provider language that we have because we really meant this to be for everyday people. Mapping allies. How is it that you can figure out people in your social network that could be helpful? How could you get people that might be helpful with a little bit of support? How could you get them on your side? So these are various components of our creative interventions model. And yes, you can just look quickly at the evaluation findings, and I'm not going to talk about that more.
And the slides will be available for all of you who want to look more into this. So next we want to move over to a quick text chat. We won't be reporting this out, but we'd love to read from you and for everyone to interact with each other. How would models like these operating in your communities support your prevention work? So I'd love to hear from all of you in the text chat and be able to read a little bit more about that. And then I also want to share this slide on connecting to prevention. So again, I want to remind us all how through this web conference, we've really been talking about how prevention and intervention need to go hand in hand. So those who are working in prevention need to find ways and resources for responding to incidents that happen in their communities. And another important thing, which I've also seen coming up in the text chat, is the whole idea about how for both intervention and prevention, when it comes to accountability and social networks, those community partnerships and empowerment are consistent approaches across both. So Mimi, can you move us into future directions? Where do you see this work heading in the future?
What I see is like many of us are in a network together, an informal network, and what we've all been talking about is how we can really mobilize more and more community members in our various communities and geographic areas to participate in community accountability, responses to violence. How is it that we can improve our skills, tools, and resources? That we still have a lot to learn about the various aspects of the models, and we'd love to do more piloting and learn from each other. How can we incorporate these strategies into options that providers can offer to their constituents? How can we apply these lessons and processes specifically to sexual assault and domestic violence? And we've been thinking about that much more, knowing that we care about safety and accountability. And finally, how can we shift our movements to address both gender violence and interpersonal violence and the violence of policing and immigration control? And I think that more and more of us are becoming aware of these intersecting forms of violence and are really trying to address them. And I see some really promising work being done.
Thank you, Mimi. So in the text chat, we did have one question coming up that I'm hoping you can tie into your description on what some of the challenges are in creating this type of change in communities. And the question is, how do you really get that buy-in from leadership in this work? And then you can share some of the challenges that you were wanting to share.
Okay. Actually, I think maybe I will go right into challenges, because I think that addresses, I mean, there have been a lot of challenges, and I'm hoping that we as a community can kind of figure out how we can move forward. So I think so many people have relied on these criminal justice responses and individualized direct service responses and feel very tied to them and can't even imagine a future without them. People like fear losing the good relationships that they've built up over time with law enforcement. It's very scary. There's a lot of resistance still to the holistic model, in particular working with the possibility of working with people doing harm and humanizing that work. I know that it has raised a lot of fears around collusion, danger, and so on. There's the continued lack of trust for our own communities because we've heard a lot of negative stories. And some of us feel like the safest way to do our work is to only have professionals doing this work. We've also been hearing that nothing works, particularly looking at better intervention programs. There are many, many challenges. How do we get buy-in? I think that some of these things one is it's slow and persistent work. So I think these webinars and the kinds of workshops that I know that I've been doing and other people have been doing, I think it has been making some kind of slow impact. I also think that for those, if you show those headlines earlier, we know that so many people are not calling law enforcement and in fact don't feel like they can necessarily trust us. And I think that kind of gets us at the heart of why we're doing this work and is really motivating more and more people to question the limitation of our responses and really look towards us. I mean, we have a lot of people on this webinar today, and I know while we can only cover so many things, that there's a curiosity out there, and I think there's a willingness for people to really start shifting and moving towards strengthening community responses. So I would just say it's this continued work. I have seen people come around and change. I also see continued resistance. A lot of different state coalitions now are really looking at helping to support shifts and changes also among their constituent agencies, so I feel that's very promising.
Definitely. Another question that had come up earlier, which kind of relates to challenges as well, and I see someone else is just text chatted right now, is with regard to funding. I know that you had that slide with the untapped opportunities, and so the question was, do you have thoughts on how resource funding should be better distributed among those groups in order to address this issue? Or is it not a question of funding?
Well, it is. Funding certainly is important. I mean, I have to say, for some of the organizations that I shared, for example, BATGC, have done amazing work without any funding whatsoever. So I know that's possible, and I still will not step away from, a call out for us to do this using whatever means necessary. But I think that also, many of us are facing limited funding. There have been some funders that have been interested in moving in different directions. Blue Cross Against Violence is one of them. I think that NOVO, the Move to End Violence cohort, is another source of funding that's actually been pretty open to these responses. What I've seen is even federal funding. Of course, we do not know what's going to happen with this in the future at all. I understand that, but Office of Violence Against Women has been more open to hearing about this. They have been having collective dialogue and are looking towards sponsoring some programs that open up in the direction of restorative justice, still with collaboration with law enforcement. But I think if those projects are moved forward, that we will all be able to learn and benefit from some of the things that they learn.
Great. So to close this off, can you share some tips with us?
Sure. Tips. I think that I'm sure all of you are thinking about exploring your own role and shifting your own organization and the movement more generally. If anybody has, for example, any leverage with funders, what is it that you can do to try to push funders to be more open to this kind of these innovations? What can you do in your organization? How can you become more familiar with some of the tools that you see here? And you have a slide with resources so you can look some of them up. How can you consider what you're already doing to, in terms of community engagement, but deepen that, expand it? How can you do that maybe in collaboration with other organizations or form a learning community? Because we all know that we cannot do this work alone as an individual or as an individual organization, but we need each other to take the next step. I think there are more and more collaborations that are forming across the country, and if you're not plugged into one already, you're welcome to also contact me or the organizers of this webinar to see where those opportunities are. I'd say take a risk. I know this is risky. These are kind of risky approaches, but I encourage you all to take a risk and take the next step. Yes, and I just want to end with this. We each have a role to play, and none of us can do this alone.
Yeah, I think that's a great way to end. We also have some resources to share. So, Mimi, I don't know, we don't have too much time, but we'll share the link.
I just wanted to say, you can look at our website for our toolkit, and there's another website with the Storytelling and Organizing Project, and those sites will be available on the upcoming slide.
And we'll also share them in the text chat. So again, it's the creative-interventions.org, also the stopviolenceeveryday.org, which has the Storytelling and Organizing Project. And Mimi has also put together a list here of a whole bunch of other resources. Again, the slides will be available, the resources will be on the Prevent Connect website, and we're sharing them in the text chat as well. So I think that is all for today. We really appreciate everyone's active participation. The text chat has been moving very quickly, and it's great to see everyone actively discussing these issues and how community accountability can be supportive for prevention and how social networks can be supportive for prevention. We've probably left you with more questions than answers, so we really do want to hear from you about what else you want to know about this topic. As I mentioned in the beginning, this was a very exploratory web conference for us. It's a new topic that we haven't really talked about in the past. So if you have any suggestions on things you may want to know in future web conferences, perhaps in our next series, please feel free to type that in the text chat. I'll hand it over to Ashley to end us off.
Yeah, thank you, Alicia. Mimi, thank you so much. I just really want to appreciate just the amazing last 90 minutes that you walked us through. And there was a comment in the text chat from Liat that said, this is the webinar I've been waiting for the last 15 years. So wow. I just want to end on that note. But it's such an important and in some ways, and for some people, a really difficult conversation. And so I'm just so grateful that you came and were on this to share with our audience about this work. So thank you.
Yes, I want to second that. Thank you, Mimi.
And for all of you, thank you so much for participating in this web conference today. I really appreciate your continued engagement and involvement, and hope to see you on our July session. Again, you can find all of our information on PreventConnect.org, and I'd really encourage you to access that new publication that I spoke about at the beginning of this session. You can find that today on our website, and thank you all so much. Have a wonderful rest of your Wednesday. Thanks again to our partners here at Prevention Institute and my Prevent Connect colleagues, and thanks again, Mimi. Take care.
Okay, thank you so much for joining.